Table 17 felt like an island. Ethan Sullivan set his teacup on its saucer with a care that was almost ritual. The tea inside had gone cold somewhere between toasts and a song about long summers. Steam had long since left it. Around him, plates scraped and laughter rose in waves, the clink of forks like a distant applause. Guests leaned closer to one another under strings of fairy lights, their conversations folded around one another in the warm hum of celebration. He watched them as if watching from behind glass, pleased for them, distant from the pleasure. He had come because it felt right to come. Rachel had loved weddings. She would have found the florals here extravagant, and the cake a sin, and would have scolded him gently for not taking more than one piece. He had been coming to other people's weddings for 3 years now, as if attendance could be an offering he made to the world she had left. He dressed the way he dressed for weathered responsibilities. A suit that fit as if it belonged to a man who could shoulder things, a tie that never quite reached the neatness of younger days. He kept his hands busy. Tonight they were busy holding a teacup that had stopped warming him. In his jacket pocket, his fingers found the familiar weight of the locket he had kept since the hospital. He turned it with the studied smallness of a man who had memorized grief into physical motion. It was a common habit, one he afforded himself in private glances. But even here, at table 17 with strangers and the lights, he could not help it. The locket was dull with handling, its hinge still true. Inside was a photo that must be kept small, or else it would become too large to fit in the palm of a hand. Rachel, laughing, caught mid-sentence, a little smudge of icing at her lip. He pressed his thumb to the glass until he felt the warmth of someone else's smile. A ribbon of music swelled as the DJ called for the next song. The lights softened into a slow beat, and couples took small, secure steps into the glow. Ethan watched the way people paired off without thinking, how easy partnership could look when you were not the one measuring absence. He had once been a man who moved through rooms with a handshake or a joke that landed just where it should. Now he counted napkins as if they were metrics of loss. The worst part was the way familiarity could disguise itself as normal. How effortlessly the world resumed its tasks of laughter and clink, while his life had been left in a separate, quieter current. He was not entirely alone. A few acquaintances from work had waved in passing. An older friend had checked in over text and promised to save a slice of lemon cake. But the current of the reception threaded through the room without him. He was present, and yet he was the only one at his small square performing attendance. Then 3 small shadows fell across his table. They arrived with the certainty of people who were small enough to be urgent and large enough in spirit to believe in the possibility of miracles. They were identical in the way only siblings born together can be. Same height, the same cautious tilt of chin, the same eyes that carried mischief and gravity in equal measure. Pink dresses, a little frayed at the hem, hair tied in 2 neat ponytails, and the smell. A bright sliver of strawberry shampoo that cut through candle wax and cologne and made him imagine a summer kitchen instead of a ballroom. "Excuse me," one said, forward and unbothered by formal receptions. Her voice was Harper's, decisive, with a rhythm that suggested she had been elected leader in a schoolyard election and planned to remain in office. "We have a mission," said the second Grace, folding her hands as if presenting a business card. "It's very important." The third, Violet, produced a crumpled $5 bill from somewhere behind her back and presented it like an offering. She held it between 2 sticky fingers as if it were a Union Jack. Ethan blinked. The DJ called for a slow song and the left side of the room melted into couples swaying. The children did not step back. They leaned in as if gravity itself had moved toward him. "We need you to pretend you're our father," Harper announced. It was not a question. It was logistics. Silence, small and precise, settled like a pinch of flour in a bowl. The 3 girls lowered their voices in perfect seconds, folding their words into whispers that the surrounding adults might mistake for a secret game. "So our mom doesn't have to sit alone," Grace added, earnest and slightly scandalized at the injustice of pity. "Please," Violet said. "We have $5. It's all we have. We can share cake with you." Ethan felt the corner of his mouth move despite himself. Rachel would have laughed at the absurdity of emotional blackmail, tendered via a crumpled bill. He could almost hear her. Where on earth did they get such theatrics? Caroline Hayes stood at a nearby table, a red dress like a punctuation mark against the paler gowns around her. Her posture was straight, not because she felt proud, but because being a single mother had taught her how to hold herself in public, so pity had less room to breathe. She glanced toward Ethan and then at the girls, and the corners of her mouth tightened into a private smile. It was not arrogant or triumphant. It was the look someone gave when they recognized a ridiculous plan that also might just work. Caroline, Ethan said before his mind fully registered that he had spoken. The name felt new in his mouth, as if saying it anchored him to this table in a way the locket never could. Her hair smelled like the strawberry shampoo the girls had carried with them. It lent the air an incongruous note of summer. Her smile softened when she realized the proposition was earnest and supervised. "You'd like to introduce me to my new dad?" she teased, voice carefully light. The girls, satisfied that the opening gambit had landed, performed a small choreography. One patted the chair beside Caroline. Another offered Ethan a glass of wine through a diplomat's flair. They arranged themselves with a seriousness that made Ethan remember how trivial his own adult ceremonies could seem to someone with such decisive purpose. "Sit," Harper said, and there was a command in it disguised as an invitation. Ethan found himself rising before logic could protest. Maybe it was the absurdity of being recruited into a child's conspiracy. Maybe it was the locket warming in his pocket like a small doctrinal ember that allowed him one night of levity. Maybe it was that three small people in matching dresses believed they could fix an adult's isolation, and he wanted, for something in himself, to be fixed. He took the chair between Caroline and the nearest cup of cake. Caroline's dress brushed his arm. They introduced themselves with less ceremony than either had expected. Names, a quick note about occupations, architect. He said it with the residue of older pride. Nurse. She said it with the economy of someone who had learned to keep explanations short. And then they allowed the children to commandeer the rest of the evening. The triplets were good at people work. They declared Ethan to be handsome, which he chastened himself for enjoying, and then instructed him on what fathers did in the presence of mothers at weddings. They danced, they clapped when cake was served, and this they gave as if revealing a law. They pretended to know all the words to the receiving line. "At home, Daddy makes funny faces," Violet confided, as if handing him a script. "Not a spa daddy," Grace added. "A real daddy." He laughed, an honest, surprised sound, and Caroline's face softened the way a page might under sunlight. It was the kind of smile that had nothing to do with charm and everything to do with relief. Relief he noticed mirrored in the girls. To them, the possibility of a father for the night was not a romantic quest. It was a shield against the small social cruelties of adult pity. They had seen people glance, tilt their heads with the unkind arithmetic of isolation, and they wanted to rewrite the calculation. Children, he thought, were often the bravest actors when it came to kindness. A song shifted the tempo, and with the quiet authority of children on a mission, the girls took hands and dragged Ethan to the center of the dance floor. He protested, but not with force. People around them cheered at the novelty. An older man raised his glass. Someone called out, "Dance, dance." The DJ slid into something slow and steady. Caroline rose as well, and when the girls insisted she take his hand too, she hesitated only a breath before their energy trumped her caution. They moved together as if in an experiment. Two grown people who had been doing their griefs in private, now adjusted on the axis of three small conductors, who refused to allow either of them to remain at the edges. The room blurred into muted colors. The close-up world of the dance tightened into the warm sweep of Caroline's shoulder, the scent of her hair, and the weight of a hand in his. Ethan led at first with the timidity of someone rediscovering a role. His steps were careful, as if the rightness of the motion could be measured and calibrated. Caroline responded with an ease he had not seen in her before. Her hand fit in his, not because it had to, but because she allowed herself the indulgence. There was a careful humor in the way the triplets clambered to stay between them, arms flailing and then settling, as if to affix this moment into reality. They did not speak at first. The dance answered with a language he could understand, the small corrections, a way of turning together that required trust, the acceptance of a rhythm offered by another person. It was astonishingly domestic, this choreography. A simple thing, but it landed like a small pledge. "You've been coming to these often," Caroline said after a while, not quite a question. He looked down at his locket for a moment before answering. "I suppose I keep trying to make sure the world doesn't forget how to be good at parties," he said, attempting levity and missing only by a hair. Rachel liked the music. Caroline's laugh was a small, private sound. She didn't frame it as condolence or pity. "My girls like cake. They don't ask much else." "They're persuasive," he admitted. He watched the three small heads nodding in unison, the way they believed in their own argument as if it were a proof of gravity. He found himself describing things he had not intended to say, that Rachel had died 3 years before, that he had kept showing up at other people's celebrations, because to stop felt like admitting there would be no more reasons to buy plane tickets or to press a tie. He spoke of the emptiness like a room with furniture but no invitation. He did not make it poetic. He wasn't capable of making grief into something ornamental tonight. He kept it in the plainness of facts. Caroline didn't respond with platitudes. She shared instead the economy of her own life in a few clear strokes. Hospital shifts that started at dusk and ended when the city was exhausted, a bedroom with 3 small beds lined in a row that never quite fit where she wanted them to, and the small superstition of checking the front door twice, because small hands could be adventurous. They found places where their stories overlapped, the ordinary inventories of people trying to keep a household upright after loss, the ways one measured time by school plays and appointments rather than grief. There was a mutual recognition that neither wanted their lives to be defined by what they had lost. It was not a sudden revelation. It was a slow, sensible alignment, like 2 maps held side by side and finding the same river. At some point the girls declared that this was not enough. Harper fluttered between their knees and whispered urgent instructions about fathers being allowed to tell bedtime stories. Grace solemnly announced that she could teach his thumbs how to tuck blankets. Violet solemnly promised that if he learned their choreographed father's face, she would allow him the first share of her cake. The ridiculousness stitched through the moment with a tenderness that made Ethan's chest loosen in a way he could neither name nor fully trust. He thought of Rachel looking at him over the tops of 3 small daughters, and would have laughed if laughter were not a traitor to the tightness in his throat. By the time the DJ cued a song with a waltz pulse, Ethan realized he did not notice the rest of the room. It was suddenly as if the world had narrowed to the circle of lights around them, the triplets like a bright constellation holding place. Caroline's face was illuminated in a way he had not seen in months. Not the carefully rehearsed public smile, but a softer openness that allowed a fatigue to echo with warmth rather than defeat. "I don't know how to be a pretend dad," he said at last, the admission almost childish in its honesty. "You can try," Harper said, as if it were the easiest thing in the world. "Dads like to pick up heavy things and then say good job. Also," Violet added, solemn as a judge, "dads are good at scaring away the monsters under the bed. If they don't know how, they can practice." Caroline watched the exchange with an expression that was complicated and human. Wary, yes. Amused, certainly. But also calculating in the very best way, measuring out the logistics of safety, time, and consequences. She would not make their life reckless. She would not ask more than they could manage, but she let herself be amused. And then she let that amusement become something kinder. "All right," she said, the word both a beginning and a boundary. "We can have this be an official trial run, one night. No obligations." Ethan felt something tender and dangerous shift in him at those words. It was a small opportunity, and he recognized smallness could be deceptive. He had spent so much time convincing himself that big gestures fixed big emptiness. Here, a single evening might be an honest test of whether he could be present in ways that mattered. They ate cake together. The triplets instructed him on the proper way to hold a fork, and how to announce that he liked the bride's bouquet, and the room hummed with a democratic mischief only small children could conduct. Laughter came easily. Caroline leaned into conversation with a way that made his sentences feel received rather than judged. When the night eased toward its later hours, and the guests began drifting outward with newly acquired good wishes and folded napkins, the triplets performed their final duty. They ensured there would be a dance that would not end too soon. They stood between Ethan and Caroline, and, hands linked, they guided the pair once more, swift and sure in their intent. The song spent its time on a long breath, and the dance answered with an intimacy that felt like a promise without commitment. Ethan noticed the little things that marked the way of comfort. How Caroline tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, and then allowed him to do it the next time when he reached without thinking. How he offered his jacket when a breeze ran through the terrace, and she took it with a gratitude that wasn't performative. How the triplets fell asleep with their heads on laps and arms slung across knees as if the family they imagined had been waiting all along to be allowed into being. He returned to table 17 later, the teacup still half full of cold tea. The locket in his pocket felt like a small compass he had been learning to trust in a new direction. When he placed his hand on the table, he noticed the crumpled $5 bill the girls had given him for his participation. It had softened at the edges from being handled, bearing a small black smudge from cake icing. The money was absurd and moving at once, a child's version of a dowry. "Mission accomplished?" the girls announced when he returned, ceremonial about the phrase the way people are of naming things for posterity. "Mission accomplished," he agreed, and meant it in the way one means a promise to attempt something humane and small. Caroline walked him to the lobby afterward because the hotel was a polite no-man's land between evenings and the city. The reception staff were stacking cake plates, the chandeliers being dimmed like eyes drawing closed. Outside, the air was cooler, smelling of early autumn and exhaust and something wholly ordinary. Garbage trucks, distant taxis, the laundry of the city settling into night. They paused beneath the hotel's awning. A taxi idled beyond the curb, and people exhaled into the street, pockets and shoulders adjusting for the next command of life. Caroline's breath came out in a fog that he could see. Her hands in the pockets of her coat were slightly tremulous. The red of her dress had become softer in this light, less punctuation and more part of the sentence. "Thank you," she said. And it wasn't the kind of gratitude that closed a transaction. It was thank you for noticing, for helping, for being present for a night she had feared would be another quiet homework on pity. "It's nothing," he said at first, then admitted, "It felt like something." She looked at him, and the look was not a plea. It was the look of a woman who had held too many pre-dawn alarms and had learned to measure risk by the way a person's eyes didn't dart away when the subject of loss came up. "Do you ever come to coffee?" she asked, an indirect way of asking permission to test a new thing that might otherwise be too raw to name. His laugh there was softer, and he found how easy it was to give his number on the back of a business card he had kept for the imagined future of networks and conferences, instead of for the present of tentative nights. "I do," he said. "Usually at a place too pretentious for me, but I can come elsewhere." There was a small absurd promise embedded in that exchange. Two people agreeing to meet in a world that pivoted on schedules and littleness. It was not a vow. It was not even a plan. It was the smallest possible opening, a hinge promising what might come if others pushed against it too. As he walked back to his car, he kept thinking of the way the triplets had claimed him for a night. He thought of the locket warm in his pocket, of Rachel's laugh far away as if she had been watching and approving by some private method of hers. He thought of the girl's smudged $5 and how children barter with the currency of belief. The night pressed against his shoulders like a coat. He had not, in the space of a few hours, walked out of grief. He understood that as clearly as he understood how the air had shifted around him. But something had been nudged. The movement felt like a small, honest thing. He had been invited to stand in a different shape for an evening, and he had said yes. When he pulled into the street outside his apartment, the city had already folded its day into neat drawers. He sat for a long moment in the car, hands on the steering wheel, listening to the quiet hiss of the engine and the distant echo of music still in his head. The locket in his pocket felt less like a weight and more like a device for measuring the temperature of his heart. He turned the key and got out, not because he was prepared for the work ahead, but because there was at least a door now that might open to more than solitude. Inside his apartment, light moved across the floors the way it always did. Mute, indifferent, patient. He set the locket beside his toothbrush on the bathroom counter like a small altar, and, for the first time in a long while, left it uncapped. On the kitchen table there was a stack of bills and a bowl of fruit beginning to wither, but the plate from the reception would not be here long. He found himself considering a choice he had not had to make in years, to prepare something to eat for himself, or to go to bed hungry, because he had been too tired to reconcile the idea of care with his own needs. He thought of the girls and their strawberry hair, of how small bodies can set into motion, without the permission of adults, a chain of tenderness. He thought of Caroline in her red dress, and the way she had met his confession with the gentleness of someone accustomed to holding both comfort and boundary. He thought of the $5 bill, and the way it had been offered as if money could transact dignity. There was an ache behind his eyes that had nothing to do with the night's exhaustion. It was the same ache that had been his companion for 3 years, the persistent knowledge that the map of his life had been redrawn, and he was here, learning to read it. Tonight had not erased that map, it had smudged an edge. Before he turned in for the night, he took a small, almost childish inventory of the evening, as if compiling a list to be checked off later. Had he been present? Had he laughed? Had he held the hands of someone who was not his immediate family? Had 3 small people found him useful? He answered yes to each and allowed himself, a dangerous, unfamiliar indulgence, to believe that such small truths mattered. Outside, the city slept in its lit windows. Inside, the teacup on table 17 sat with a film gathered where warmth had left it. He imagined the hotel recycling the napkins and stacking the chairs, and, somewhere between the pile and the dawn, the triplets asleep in a small apartment down the street, hands knotted together like a promise to themselves. Ethan lay awake for a while, turning the $5 bill between his fingers like a talisman. He did not know what would happen next. He only knew that when he shifted in bed, the locket caught the moonlight and shone with the faint, private gleam of things kept safe. He let himself return to the shape of sleep with that small light in his palm. The next morning was a thing that would either become ordinary or extraordinary depending on what they chose to do next. And for the first time in years, he felt like someone might choose with him instead of for him. The morning after unspooled into a slow, careful day. Ethan found himself making his way to a small cafe 2 blocks from the hospital where Caroline worked, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu that declared the scones dangerously buttery. He arrived early, because habit had taught him that being early meant fewer excuses not to be there, and he ordered something hot and plain. Black coffee, no frills, the way his mornings had been for years. Caroline arrived looking as if she'd carved a minute into her schedule, just to stand in the door and breathe. Her scrubs were folded into a bag at her feet. She had traded them for the red scarf the girls loved to tug at when they wanted attention. Under the lamplight, her eyes were the color of someone who had lived many nights on coffee and adrenaline, who counted time in shift lengths and small mercies. When she smiled at him, it was the same soft relief he'd seen between fairy lights. A glance that said, "Thank you for showing up." They talked simply at first. Caroline described a shift that had been long, how a young patient had surprised the team with tiny victories and threatened backward with exhaustion, how she had held a hand through a morphine haze and then been handed a stack of discharge paperwork by noon that made her laugh cynically at the idea that medicine ever concluded anything neatly. Ethan listened and interrupted with small questions. Exactly the kind of interruptions that invited further disclosure, not charity. "You could have told me you needed a miracle, and I would have brought one," he joked when she ordered a pastry she couldn't possibly finish. She smiled, but there was a thread of gravity in the arc of her mouth. "Miracles are expensive," she said, "and my miracles have deductible plans." He admitted without theatrics that he had been scared of doing this wrong. "The thing I fear is being clumsy with people who are already fragile," he said. "Not knowing how to be part of a life because I'm used to being absent from mine." Caroline's response was not a tidy reassurance. "You won't get it right all the time," she said, "but you can show up. Sometimes that's the lesson for a lot of us, showing up even when the match strikes you wrong." There was a pause where 2 mugs cooled in front of them. Between the steam and the hum of the cafe, she asked the question that had been lodged behind polite conversation. "Are you ready to risk being disappointed again?" He thought of Rachel like a familiar weather pattern shooting across a horizon. "Ready to be disappointed is different from ready to risk hoping," he said, careful. "I'm not sure I'm ready to give away expectation without a seatbelt, but I can try to hold hope in my hands like a fragile thing." She let that stand. The rest of the morning unfolded not as a plan, but as a negotiation of small agreements. Meet for coffee next week, sometimes on weekends if schedules allowed. Text if plans changed. No pressure to define things too soon. When Ethan stepped back into the city, the locket warmed in his pocket, as if to remind him the world still held memory and possibility in the same palm. The $5 bill the girls had given him remained folded inside his wallet, like a small, improbable relic. He found himself smiling in situations that had once bent his face into armor. The smile arrived when a commuter led him into traffic, when a barista spelled his name right, when the city offered an accidental kindness. They were tiny, cumulative changes, surfaces of other people's days that his touch now altered. The weeks that followed were honest and slow. They met between shifts, between meetings, sometimes for lunch in the hospital cafeteria where Caroline's breaks were shaded by the high windows and the vending machine's weak light. On other nights, Ethan would come to their small, crowded apartment with a bouquet of grocery store flowers and an offer to do the dishes. He was careful with domestic tasks, uncertain at first how many of the triplets' demands were routine and how many were tests of endurance. He learned that Harper required the quietest bedtime story, that Grace preferred dramatic voices, and that Violet insisted on a kiss on both cheeks and a check for monsters that involved tucking a shirt under the pillow. Just in case. They built patterns. Saturday mornings at the park where Ethan learned the art of unhurried swings and how to time a push so a child could feel the air in her stomach. Sunday afternoons of pancake experiments that sometimes failed and were forgiven with whipped cream and giggles. There were small missteps. Once Ethan promised to pick the girls up from school and got stuck fixing a meeting. His apology came with a bouquet of apologies and a comic book for the girls that made them forgive and then tease him for being late dad. The trust grew not from perfect performance, but from the steady acceptance of trying again. Grief threaded through those months. It did not evaporate. There were evenings when Ethan would come home and open the jewelry box he'd kept in his bedroom and simply touch the edge where Rachel's handwriting had once been pressed into a card. He showed Caroline the box one night when the girls were asleep, and the apartment hummed with refrigerator noise. Inside, beside a small necklace Rachel had worn on their wedding day, was a photograph Ethan kept loose because he wanted it to be tangible. It was Rachel mid-laugh, a smear of cake at her lip, an echo of the image he'd kept in the locket. Caroline handled the memory with a steadiness that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with respect. "She looks like someone who lived loudly," she said. Ethan nodded. "She did, in ways that didn't always have room for nuance," he admitted. "She would have been furious at me if I stopped living too." "I don't ask you to stop being loyal," Caroline said, stopping him with a hand that steadied. "I ask you to let loyalty be part of what you build now, not the only brick." There were small, tender rituals that stitched their lives together. Ethan found himself learning to do the small things that meant the world, fixing a leaking faucet at midnight, becoming proficient at reheating leftovers into something edible, and learning the exact way Violet preferred her hair braided. Once when Caroline had worked a double and collapsed on the couch with exhaustion visible in the hollows of her cheekbones, Ethan made a dinner of comforting soup and sat in the doorway until she woke. "You don't have to make everything dramatic for me to feel cared for," she told him then, voice rough with tiredness and protest. "Just the small things are enough." He filed that away, learning it as one learns a new language of intimacy. The triplets watched these exchanges with the clarity children possess. They accused Ethan, delightfully and often, of trying too hard sometimes, and then would exaggerate his efforts into performances that made him laugh until his ribs ached. Several months after the wedding reception, when their relationship had acquired a language of its own, less theatrical, more a series of habits and returns, Caroline had a night at the hospital that did not resolve neatly. A patient in the pediatric ward had taken a turn. It was the kind of case that elbowed all other concerns aside, and then refused to be hurried. Caroline came off shift with her badge still hanging, her gloves crumpled in a pocket. Her face had the drained look of someone who'd run a marathon in a dream. They'd been texting earlier in the evening, gentle check-ins that did not press. Ethan had been fixing a light at home and, between the screwdriver and the bulb, felt a quiet that made him think of her. Then a message arrived. "I'm outside." He drove without asking for directions, without rehearsal, because some emergencies are not about danger, but about whether someone will appear and hold a thing steady. The hospital parking lot smelled of winter diesel and disinfectant. Under sodium lights, the world compressed into bands of fluorescent clarity and shadow. Caroline sat on the concrete curb, her coat wrapped tight, shoulders hunched as if against some inner weather. She looked smaller than she had the night they'd met, and the sight of it made the air feel raw. "How bad?" Ethan asked when he crouched beside her. The question was smaller than he wanted it to be, and therefore honest. She let out a breath that sounded like a leak. "It was a lot," she said. Not only the patient, the entire shift felt like holding up a boulder with a spoon. He reached out and took her hand without asking, the way you close a book knowing how its pages will feel. "You don't have to carry it all tonight," he said. His voice was low, grainy, with the texture of being awake for someone else. She looked at him then, and for a long moment it was as if they were testing the temperature of the world in each other's eyes. There was a tremor in her laugh, half apology, half revelation. "I am tired of being a fortress by myself," she said, the admission ragged but candid. "Sometimes I want someone to be inside the walls." Ethan's hands found the space behind her shoulders, as if remembering an old memory of how tenderness could be distributed. "You have me," he said. They did not speak for a while. The quiet in the lot wrapped around them like a cloak. The city hummed in the distance. A taxi idled and then left angrily. Under the sodium light, the scar of the day looked smaller, not erased but contained. Caroline's shoulders lowered a fraction. Tears had tracked tracks on her cheeks, glinting in the parking lot light like tiny regrets. Ethan leaned in with the slow certainty of someone who had practiced stepping toward belonging. He kissed her then, not the fevered, desperate kiss of fiction, but a steady grounding one that said, "I will be present." It was public, quiet, and utterly unperformative. When she responded, it was with the measure of someone who had been holding her breath, and finally allowed something other than duty to fill the air. They walked home slowly, the hospital visit a hinge between the exhaustion of care and the beginning of mutual reliance. From then on, there were not only shared dinners and visits, there were errands done together, small choices made on evenings and weekends, a network forming that held agency not as ownership, but as mutual care. Ethan learned the cadence of Caroline's exhaustion, the way she would always take a second to stand on the porch and breathe before coming in, and he adjusted his presence accordingly. He'd bring tea and not ask questions. She learned the dialect of his loneliness and found ways to let him speak it without being swallowed by it. Time accumulated into months. There were weekend mornings when the triplets fell asleep in a heap of limbs on the couch after a marathon of board games. There were ordinary arguments about parenting methods, about whose turn it was to take out the recycling, about the right time to let Harper ride her bike a block alone. These arguments were not ruptures, but a tapestry of negotiation. Ethan fumbled and then found the groove. He began to move through the apartment with the kind of intuitiveness that reveals a person who is present often enough to know where the spoons live. One afternoon, while the girls were at school, Ethan stood in the doorway of Caroline's bedroom and looked at Rachel's jewelry box on the dresser. He'd promised himself he would not make their whole life about what came before, and yet the things that belonged to Rachel were pieces of history he could not simply shelve away. He lifted the lid and found the small necklace, the muted photograph. He slipped his finger under the glass of the locket to feel the warm edge, the way metals remember the heat of palms. Caroline came up behind him and put a hand on his shoulder. "You keep it," she said. "Not because of what it was, but because of what it means to you." He set the box down then, not closing it. "I want to make sure I'm honest about the past," he said. "Not hiding it, not making it a ghost that rules the house." "That's all I want," Caroline said. "Space for both of us." The next year moved with the tempered speed of lives that have learned to handle urgency. Ethan proposed in the thin light of a weeknight. No stage, no flair. The triplets were tucked into bed, reluctantly, after one of Violet's drawn-out negotiations about whether the moon could be turned off if they were scared. Ethan had a small plan. No big speech, only a small moment that felt right. He set the locket on the kitchen table, open so that the photograph glinted, and pulled out a folded scrap of the $5 bill the girls had given him. It seemed fitting that the instrument of their introduction, absurd and precious, would be present. Caroline paused at the threshold of the kitchen and smiled at the sight of the two small relics. She slid into the chair across from him. No affectation, no dress rehearsal. He spoke then, quietly. "I've been thinking about what it means to choose a life with someone who's already loved and lost," he said. "I don't want to erase the people we've lost. I want to make room beside them. I want to be in the everyday with you. I want to try honestly. Will you marry me?" Caroline blinked, and the look that crossed her face was complicated and luminous, an unguarded shimmer. "Yes," she said, and the word came like a choice, deliberate and kind. They called the triplets in straight away. They woke as if summoned by ceremony, and were ecstatic until drowsiness won. The girls demanded the story be told 100 ways that night, each retelling richer than the last until even the cat seemed interested. The announcement to friends and family was small. A year passed in which they merged routines and occasionally bumped knees. There were new arrangements. A shelf for Ethan's drafting tools in a corner of the living room, a third toothbrush holder in the sink. There were moments of reverence. Rachel's picture found a respectful place on the mantel during the small ceremony they planned. They spoke of her out loud sometimes, not as interruption, but as testament. They invited friends and a select few colleagues, the kind of people who would bring good food and then help clear the kitchen afterwards. The triplets wrote their own vows, which were mostly promises to allow tickles and to make their father laugh. The wedding itself had none of the ostentation of the reception Ethan had once sat through on table 17. It was a Sunday afternoon on the lawn of a small community hall, strings of lights turning the early evening into a softer realm. Caroline wore a dress that had a shade of red in it, a tribute to that first night, and Ethan wore a suit that fit easier now that he had learned to smile in it. The girls were in matching dresses and walked down the makeshift aisle with oversized bouquets, whispering instructions as they went. There were echoes, unmistakable and gentle, of that first night. At one point, Ethan caught Caroline's eye across the yard and saw the same look he'd first seen under the hotel's awning, the look of two people who'd agreed, softly, to put their hands toward something together. He thought of the first teacup with its ring of cold, and how many cups he'd since had warm in his lap with Caroline's hand sometimes brushing his. They exchanged vows that held no grand promises to fix all sorrow, but did make a brave and precise set of commitments, to show up for midnight calls, to let grief speak its truth without derailing new joy, to let their house be loud and messy and hospitable. When it came time to exchange rings, the girls took their part solemnly. Harper slipped a small ribbon around Ethan's wrist as a good luck charm, as she pronounced it, which he wore for weeks afterwards. The reception was a collage of small, honest moments. Friends told stories of the couple with easy tenderness. Caroline's co-workers crowded the dance floor and clapped for the triplets' improvised performance of a song that could have been written by a committee of 6-year-olds. Ethan danced with Caroline under a string of lights, the world again narrowing to the back of her neck, the smell of her strawberry-scented shampoo transported in memory to softer years, the music folding them in an easy, adult intimacy. The $5 bill, framed later, found a place in a drawer labeled "Good Luck Things," a private relic of the way small currency had bought a lifetime of laughter. They moved in together, not with grand renovations, but with slow, domestic collaboration. Ethan learned which light bulbs Caroline preferred, and how the girls liked their hair combed for school. They adopted new rhythms, not perfect ones, but flexible, seasoned with forgiveness. There were days when Caroline's shifts made her disappear for stretches, and Ethan became the full-time parent in a small, honorable way. He learned the recipe for Grace's favorite pudding, and how Violet liked her socks folded. He found in the mundane a kind of sanctity, putting folded clothes in the drawer with a practiced hand, leaving notes of encouragement on the fridge, taking a child to the dentist when Caroline could not. When they found out Caroline was pregnant, an unexpected, luminous surprise, the house erupted. The girls squealed with the kind of disbelief that turned into household proclamations. "We're going to have a baby sibling," they declared, then queried whether the baby would like strawberries. The pregnancy stitched them closer with the urgency of a common project, painting the nursery a soft, forgiving color, arguing over what kind of mobile would be safe and not just pretty, buying tiny sleepers and laughing at the smallness of them. They kept a corner of the nursery reserved as a memory shelf, Rachel's photograph, the small necklace, a framed pewter star that Ethan's sister had given him. It wasn't about living in the past, but honoring what had been meaningful enough to carry forward. The children would sometimes pause in front of the shelf and ask gentle questions about Aunt Rachel, which the parents answered with a mixture of clarity and warmth. "She loved you very much," they'd say, "and she taught your daddy to dance badly but enthusiastically." Years folded into themselves. The house gained new marks of life, crayon lines on door frames, a dent in the coffee table from where a soccer ball had found everything except the street, a plant Ethan kept alive despite initial inexpertise. The girls grew taller and louder, their voices stretching toward adolescence as they developed personal styles and secret codes of loyalty. They remained, in their way, the architects of this family's shape, advocates for board game nights, for ridiculous traditions like pancake Sundays, for truth-telling about who had stolen the last cookie. Ethan's grief did not vanish. He still kept the locket on the dresser sometimes, or the necklace tucked into a pocket for days when the absence felt more raw. But the shape of his life had widened to hold more than one kind of loss. He found humor again, and indulged in reckless smallness now. He would be the parent who invented new bedtime endings or told terrible jokes that the girls made him repeat until they were clichés. The new baby arrived on a rain-damped morning. The house felt like a ship that had just been steadied. Caroline labored with the steady iron mind of someone who had known the cost and the joy of children. Ethan stood by, hands steady. When the baby's first cry split the air, it felt like reassurance, a sound both fragile and definitive. The triplets, who had once recruited a stranger into fatherhood for one night, were now officially sisters to a sibling, who would call Ethan Dad, as matter-of-factly as she drew breath. Time's arc carried them forward. The small rituals of care accumulated into deep-rooted belonging. The family weathered ordinary storms and the occasional griefs that life presents, an ailing friend, a move, the complicated business of adolescence. Ethan worked as an architect who now sometimes designed playgrounds because he liked the thought of people meeting each other on slides and benches. Caroline's nursing career evolved. She took a supervising role that demanded more of her hours, but sat on the other side of that demand with a steady sense of purpose. There were moments when the presence of Rachel was tenderly conspicuous. On the child's 10th birthday, Ethan found a note Rachel had once tucked into a book of poetry. He had kept it hidden and presented it as a small treasure, reading aloud the lines that made everyone in the room, including the triplets, fall softly into a hush. They all treated her memory as part of family history, an ancestor not of blood but of affection and influence. 10 years later, the house hummed with the kind of organized noise that bespoke lives loudly lived. The triplets had become young women, Harper at the head of a table as she planned the details of her own wedding, Grace shadowing her with spreadsheets and lists, Violet insisting the playlist be perfect, their laughter still threaded through the house like a favorite tune. The youngest, now a bright and steady child of 9, moved through the corridors with the ease of one who had grown up in a home where affection was abundant and honest. Harper's wedding was a small, deliberate echo of the first scene that had set everything in motion. A wedding reception full of fairy lights, a DJ cueing long songs, the clink of forks, and the rise of laughter. Ethan felt a soft, private tremor as he took his seat and looked out over tables that held friends and kin. He noticed, with the strange clarity of someone who had once stood apart, that he was not a man at table 17 anymore. He was a father whose identity had been prayerfully negotiated through tiny acts. He watched Harper move across the lawn, looking more like Caroline now than she had as a child, a gentle laugh at the edges of her mouth, an indomitable earnestness when she proposed ridiculous wedding plans. There was a small moment when she and her new partner swayed in the center of a circle of friends and family. Ethan felt the same particular kind of warmth he'd once felt when Caroline's hair smelled of strawberry shampoo, an aromatic scheduling of memory that returned him to tenderness. After the ceremony, Ethan found himself remembering the night the triplets had marched up to table 17 with their crumpled $5 bill. He thought of the absurdity and bravery of that act, the way 3 small people could imagine rearranging an adult's life by insisting he play a part. He thought of Rachel, with a smile that held no accusation. He felt the weight of what he had lost, and the fullness of what he'd gained in a way that made him, briefly, unreadable to strangers. The dance came later when the sky had acquired a thin violet. Ethan took Caroline in his arms and felt the surety of 10 years of practice. He let the beat slow, letting the world narrow to the place where her forehead rested against his chest, and their breathing found a cadence. Around them bodies moved and lights twinkled, and for a moment he tasted the old cold tea ring of memory and let it dissolve in something warm and shared. At the end of the night, Harper and her partner pulled the first dance like the official opening of a life. Ethan watched and then saw Harper glance in his direction. She mouthed a small "thank you" across the light-splashed crowd, the kind of gratitude that did not require explanation. He raised his glass and the movement was simple. A ritual of acknowledgement between those who had built a life out of small promises. Later, when the music slowed and people drifted out into the cooling air, Ethan stood on the edge of the lawn and looked at the city beyond like someone who had once feared being adrift. He felt the locket heavy in his pocket, the metal a companion that had shifted from weight to talisman. He found Caroline's hand and squeezed it, a small signal they had used for years. "Do you remember?" she said softly. "The first night?" He laughed, a low sound that matched the contentment in his chest. "How could I forget a $5 bill?" They stood in the night and watched people leave in pairs and small clusters. A waitress cleared a table and placed a chipped teacup on a tray. He felt, in the ordinary sweep of things, the quiet affirmation that small acts accumulate into a life. The girls, now women, drifted by and flung themselves into a group hug that included the new child, who still smelled faintly of baby shampoo even at 9, and who laughed as if the world would always welcome noise. On the way home there was a moment, in the car's hush, when Caroline reached across and took Ethan's face in both hands, a familiar gesture they had used to refocus each other through storms. "We didn't fix everything," she said, "but we made a life that answers back. That to me is holiness enough." He listened, feeling the straight line between the man who had sat at table 17 holding cold tea, and the father who now, by the light of a decade, could name a tray of ordinary things as the altar of his days. "It's more than enough," he said. They arrived home and opened the door into a house that smelled of soap and the faint must of flowers left from the ceremony. The children, older now, quieter in the way of those who have learned secrets of their own, went to bed without much fuss. Ethan placed the locket on the dresser, then stopped and left it open. He added beside it, the $5 bill folded and pressed flat beneath a paperweight carved by Grace in a summer craft class. The relics were not relics at all, but parts of an ongoing story. There were no grand proclamations. No single moment erased the years of sorrow. What changed was the accretion of small mercies, the continued practice of turning toward another person and saying, "I will hold this with you." The family that had once formed around three audacious girls and a stranger's willingness to play at fatherhood had become something durable and loud and tender. When Ethan tucked himself into bed that night, he thought of Rachel with a fond, unobtrusive kind of love. Not the raw ache that had been his constant companion, but a companion to his companion. He thought of the girls who had once asked him to pretend, who had in fact given him the chance to become. He thought with an amazed gratitude of the ways small, brave choices had bent the course of his life toward belonging. If this story touched you, consider subscribing for more honest, heart-centered tales, little invitations to keep showing up for the people who need you.